Your best friend comes to you and says, I've been praying about something for weeks and God still hasn't answered my prayer. How would you respond? We've probably all experienced this at one time or another. Today is Mothering Sunday, and I want to use the story of Hannah, who had lost all hope that she could be a mother, to illustrate how God does answer prayer. Hannah was a woman who'd prayed to God for years, and God had not answered her prayers yet. Her husband, Elkanah, was a respectable, God-fearing man, probably quite affluent, as he had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Polygamy was permitted in the Old Testament times. It ensured there was succession and children to support the work within a family. And at a time when young men were killed in battle, it meant that women who would otherwise have been left destitute were supported. But this did not necessarily make for happy families, and this was certainly the case with Hannah and Peninnah. We don't know which of Elkanah's wives was his first and which was his second wife. However, we do know that Hannah was infertile. She had been unable to give him any children, and Peninnah had at least 4 children. There's a reference to in the Bible passage to sons and daughters. Infertility today is a great sadness to many couples. In Old Testament times, it was seen as a failure, a social disgrace. Elkanah could have quite legitimately divorced her. Hannah could have offered one of her servant women to sleep with Elkanah and so produce a child in her place. However, Elkanah does neither. He remains lovingly devoted to Hannah, despite this potential social criticism and his rights under civil law. Elkanah tried to console Hannah, to show her how much he loved her. But Peninnah's taunts make her position intolerable. This was certainly not a happy household. You can probably imagine the scene. Year after year, the entire family travelled to Shiloh to offer sacrifice required at the various festivals during the year. Possibly with one more child each year in Peninnah's arms, and still no baby for Hannah to hold. It's thought that this particular festival that the family were attending was the Feast of Tabernacles. This feast celebrated God's care for his people during the wilderness years as they approached Canaan. But it was also a time of joy and feasting for God's blessing over that year's crops. This would have made Hannah's sorrow over her infertility all the more poignant as people celebrated the fertility of the land. Hannah comes to the tabernacle, and whilst everyone is feasting and celebrating, she sits quietly, possibly in a dim corner, weeping and praying to God, just one-to-one, silently. She makes a promise with God. If you give me a son, I will offer him to your service for his entire life. And she promises that he will never cut his hair, a sign, an outward sign of commitment to work for God. I wonder, how often do we try and bargain with God? If you give me this, then I'll do that. God is not someone to be bartered with. However, when our prayers are answered, do we somehow conveniently forget our side of the bargain? Do we keep it? God always keeps his promises. Do we keep ours? we know that Hannah did keep her promise, and not just for a limited time. Samuel, when he was around 3 years old, was given to the care of Eli, the high priest, and he became the last and one of the greatest judges of Old Testament times, and led the way for kings like Saul and David to lead the Jewish nation. This promise was personally extremely costly to Hannah. Samuel, her son, her only son at that time, was the one thing she wanted most in the world. Yet she was willing to keep her promise and offer him to God. So what can we learn from the story of Hannah? The purpose of the story of Hannah is not that God will always remove infertility or any other physical problem. Sadly, we all know couples who have remained childless despite the advances in medical science. The purpose of the story is that Hannah and we are encouraged to have a belief in the power of prayer. Hannah could well have felt bitter and discouraged. She was unable to have children. She had to share her husband with a woman who taunted and ridiculed her. Her husband couldn't solve her problem as much as he tried. But instead of giving up hope, Hannah came to God in prayer in a quiet, unassuming way. She honestly and frankly brought her situation to God. She probably did get angry with God. She laid it out before him. She didn't try and pretend everything was okay. God does answer prayer. We can see that through the story of Hannah. But he answers it in his time and for his purposes. I wonder, do we sometimes feel impotent in our prayer life? If you have an unanswered prayer list, remember the story of Hannah. God never leaves prayers unanswered. Just he answers them in his way, with his timing, and for his purpose. If God had immediately answered Hannah's prayers for a son and given her a son, she would not have placed him at the tabernacle at Shiloh to grow into a man of God in the public gaze, ready for leadership. God is sovereign. He can overrule events that we think are impossible. The story of Hannah illustrates how God works with problems of everyday life and, contrary to our natural expectations, brings about surprising reversals. But just at the end, think about what you pray for. What are your motives? What are the consequences? Hannah promised her son to God. She followed through on her promise, as painful as that was. I wonder, what does our prayer cost us? Are we prepared to make sacrifice for God? Do we put a time limit on it? Or do we, like Hannah, offer our entire lives to God?